Imagine standing in a torchlit chamber carved deep beneath the Exhibition Desert in the year 2200 BC. You are a young soldier, summoned at midnight with orders that make no sense. Bring honey, 10 jars of it. Tell no one where you're going. Now you watch as servants pour that golden liquid over a trembling boy standing on a stone platform, coating every inch of his skin until he gleams in the flickering firelight. The boy has been trained not to speak, not to cry, not to move, but his eyes tell a different story. His eyes are screaming, then you hear it. The buzzing of thousands of wings. Clay containers around the room begin to shake violently, and inside them are creatures that have been deliberately starved and agitated. Scarab beetles, fire ants, wasps bred specifically for aggression. But there's a fourth container in the corner, and what's inside that one will haunt Egyptian nightmares for the next 4,000 years. The pharaoh enters. He is 96 years old, though some sources claim he reached 100. He has ruled Egypt for 90 years, since he was 6 years old. He has outlived 8 generations of his own descendants. His name is Pepi II, and what happens next will be systematically erased from Egyptian records, yet whispered about by priests, documented by foreign observers, and discovered in mass graves that archaeologists still struggle to process. With one gesture from his withered hand, the servants release the insects. The beetles arrive first, a living carpet of black shells swarming across the honey-covered skin. Each beetle begins to feed, their mandibles designed to tear through hide far tougher than human flesh. Then come the ants, rivers of fire following the honey trails, each one injecting venom that burns exactly as their name suggests. By the time the wasps arrive, the boy's face has already begun to swell beyond recognition. The sounds that echo off these specially designed walls are not just from physical pain, but they come from the realization that this is entertainment, that suffering has become performance, that the ancient pharaoh watching from his golden throne is leaning forward, not in horror but in fascination. He occasionally calls out adjustments like a conductor refining a symphony. More honey on the feet, release another wave of ants. Let the beetles concentrate on the more sensitive areas. This session will last 3 hours. The boy will survive, barely. He will be taken to recovery chambers where skilled physicians will keep him alive, not from mercy but from economics. He is expensive to replace. He will heal over weeks, fed special foods to restore his strength, treated with salves to minimize scarring. And then, when he has recovered just enough, it will happen again and again until he ages beyond the pharaoh's interest or dies from accumulated trauma. This boy is one of approximately 50,000 children who will disappear into Pepi's chambers over a 94-year reign. But before I tell you how a 6-year-old child became history's most prolific creditor, before I explain how an entire civilization restructured itself to feed one man's appetites, you need to understand something historians rarely discuss. Pepi II was not born evil. He was crafted, shaped, evolved through a perfect storm of unlimited power, childhood trauma, and 9 decades of never experiencing consequences. What you're about to learn is not just ancient history, it's a blueprint that repeats whenever humans gain absolute power for too long. If you're drawn to the hidden and horrifying truths of history, consider subscribing to this channel. Every story I uncover matters because understanding how power corrupts helps us recognize these patterns in our own world. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that is unafraid to look into the darkest corners of human civilization. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from, because this story reaches across continents and centuries to remind us what we're capable of when no one can say no. Every monster has an origin story. For Pepi II, it began in 2278 BC with blood, betrayal, and a coronation that would shatter a 6-year-old mind into something unrecognizable. His father, Pepi I, died from what officials called a scorpion sting. Strange how that scorpion managed to bypass 14 guards, navigate through 4 locked doors, avoid 2 food tasters sleeping in the outer chamber, and deliver a fatal sting that left wounds exactly matching a bronze dagger's width. Even stranger was how the crown prince, Pepi's older brother, died the same week from river fever despite being in the deep desert for 3 months, nowhere near water. That left little Neferkare known as Pepi, the 4th son. Nobody expected to matter. A quiet boy who played with wooden soldiers and followed his mother through the women's quarters. A child so far from succession that no one had bothered to train him for power. Within 7 days he would be covered in blood, crowned as a living god, and discover something dark within himself that would grow for the next 9 decades. The coronation of a pharaoh was designed to transform human into divine. But what happens when you perform this ritual on a mind too young to understand the difference between symbol and reality? The ceremony began at dawn. Priests stripped the child naked before 3,000 watching nobles. A white bull, specially raised for this moment, was led into the hall. Its throat was cut with such precision that the blood fountained directly into a golden basin large enough to bathe in. The bull's eyes were still blinking when they lifted the child and plunged him into its blood. He was held under until his lungs burned, until his small body thrashed in panic, until the moment before drowning. Then they pulled him up, gasping and crimson, expecting the normal reaction of a terrified 6-year-old, tears screaming, the desperate need for his mother. Instead, little Pepi laughed. Not nervous laughter, not hysteria, but the delighted giggle of a child who had discovered something wonderful. He looked at his blood-covered hands with fascination, tasted his fingers, then asked the priests if he could go under again. Now came the test that would prove divine right to rule. A prisoner was brought forward, forced to kneel before the blood-soaked child. The priests handed Pepi a ceremonial bronze blade, a weapon made for adult hands that the 6-year-old could barely lift. His instructions were simple. Remove the head. Prove that the god's power flows through you. The first strike missed entirely. The weight pulled the child off balance, and he tumbled forward into the pooling blood. The court held its breath. Would he cry? Would this break the illusion? Pepi stood up slowly, studying the blade with the concentration of a student learning to write. He adjusted his grip, planted his feet differently, and tried again. It took 11 blows before the head finally separated. By then, the prisoner had been dead for several minutes, but the child pharaoh didn't stop until the job was complete. Then came the moment that revealed what Pepi would become. He picked up the severed head, looked into its dead eyes, and whispered something. When asked what he had said, the new pharaoh replied with words that would define his reign. He had asked the head what death tasted like, and though it couldn't answer, he thought he understood anyway. Death, he declared, tasted like power. 23 women stood before the new pharaoh, his father's secondary wives, who tradition demanded accompany the dead king to the afterlife. But the 6-year-old god king had been transformed by blood and violence. He wanted to understand death, to see it happen slowly enough to observe every detail. For 4 hours he watched 23 women die by slow strangulation. He didn't look away once. He occasionally asked the executioners to adjust their technique, to vary the pressure, to try different angles. He wasn't just watching. He was studying, learning the exact moment when panic turned to acceptance, when the body stopped fighting, when the light left the eyes. By age 8, Pepi had discovered that certain poisons caused paralysis without death. He spent months testing different combinations, documenting which mixtures allowed victims to remain conscious but unable to move. At age 9, he made a philosophical breakthrough that would shape his entire reign. Pain was not singular but multiple. Like wine could be sweet or bitter. Suffering came in different varieties. He began categorizing types of agony with the dedication of a scholar, creating what he called his great work, a comprehensive exploration of every form of human suffering. The honey rituals began when Pepi was 52, in his 46th year of rule. By then, individual victims no longer satisfied him. He needed spectacle. He needed ceremony. The idea came from watching warehouse workers who had spilled honey and been swarmed by insects. Here was suffering that came from nature itself, pain that could be blamed on sacred creatures, torment that looked like divine judgment. The first honey chamber was simple, but simple was never enough for Pepi. Within a year, it had expanded into a complex of 9 interconnected chambers. The insects were cultivated with precision. Scarab beetles fed exclusively on raw meat until they associated flesh with food. Fire ants selected for venom potency. Wasps kept in constant agitation. The honey itself became a science, mixed with substances that drove insects into frenzy. A typical session followed strict protocols lasting 3 hours or more, paused and restarted multiple times to prevent death from shock. Pepi would watch from his platform, calling out adjustments, treating each session like a performance he was directing. Some boys endured this dozens of times over months before their bodies finally gave out. The recovery chambers, the disposal methods, the networks of procurement that delivered a constant supply across 90 years. This was not madness. This was system. This was what happens when a damaged child becomes a god and rules for nearly a century, without anyone ever telling him no. The Old Kingdom of Egypt collapsed shortly after Pepi's death in 2184 BC. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period, a time of chaos and fragmentation that lasted over a century. They cite drought, economic collapse, and political instability. But ancient texts whisper another truth, that 50,000 missing children left holes in Egyptian society that could never be filled, that entire villages had been emptied to feed one man's obsessions, that when the god king finally died at 100 years old, the people looked at what had been done in the name of divinity and decided that perhaps some gods should never have been crowned at all. Leave a comment below and tell me what haunts you most about this story. Is it the transformation of an innocent child into a monster, the systems that enabled him for 9 decades, or the reminder that, given enough power and enough time, any of us might discover what we're truly capable of becoming?